Story 1. Bread and Whispers, the secret power of Roman bakers. It's not the generals, emperors, or senators who held the empire together. No, it was men with ash-covered arms, heat-scarred faces, and dough-caked hands. Roman bakers' pistors were the unsung foundation of daily life in the Eternal City. They were everywhere and nowhere, awake before dawn, asleep before the city dined, and ever present at the beating heart of Roman domesticity, the fornax, the oven. Let us walk with them. Before the sun, the march of the bakers. In a Roman insula, an apartment block where the city's commoners packed themselves like amphorae in a cellar, the earliest stirrings of the city did not come from soldiers, orators, or prostitutes. It was the baker, shaking off sleep, perhaps cursing under his breath as he moved toward his workshop. The pistrinum, a combined mill and bakery, was often built into the lower floors of these crowded urban dwellings, humming with life while the rest of the city dreamed. The baker's apprentice or enslaved laborer would already be hauling sacks of grain. Roman baking was, above all, logistical. Water had to be drawn, mills had to be turned, ovens stoked. In smaller shops, millstones were turned by hand, but in wealthier bakeries, donkeys or slaves marched in dull repetition to rotate the grinding stones. Grain arrived from Egypt, the empire's pantry, as part of the Annona Rome's free grain distribution system. For the baker, grain wasn't merely flour in waiting. It was currency, debt, politics, and danger. It had to be measured precisely. Too much spoilage and you might be fined. Too little flour and you'd lose customers. Too much success and you'd attract imperial attention, a deeply mixed blessing. The dough before the storm. Bakers did not work alone. Most ran with a small team, a pister, his apprentices, enslaved workers, and maybe his wife who managed accounts or soothed angry clients. Once the grain was ground to a fine sandy powder, it was time to add water, oil, and salt. Yeast was tricky. Roman bakers typically used sourdough starter, known as fermentum, from leftover dough kept from the day before. The temperature and humidity affected everything. A baker learned to listen to the dough. If the dough didn't sound right when slapped, too wet, too quiet, too bubbly, it meant something was off. And yet mistakes were not tolerated. Bread was serious. The ovens and the ashes. The oven, or fornax, was the fiery core of the shop. It needed hours to preheat, fed with olive wood or pine. Inside, temperatures could reach upwards of 450 degrees Celsius. The baker needed to be quick, precise, and strong. Each batch had to be loaded with long-handled paddles, then rotated and pulled before burning. Most bread was marked with a stamp, either the baker's own or a customer, to ensure the right loaf reached the right buyer. Loaves were round and scored with lines, like flowers blooming under soot. These were no baguettes or golden loaves. They were dense, chewy, deeply browned, and lasted days. The wealthy might buy custom bread stuffed with figs, nuts, or honey, but the poor ate panis plebeius, the coarse daily bread. You can still see some of these loaves, carbonized by Vesuvius in Pompeii, marked with names like Seller, slave of Quintus Granius Verus. The gossip network begins. Rome was a city of mouths, and the baker had access to all of them. By dawn, clients arrived. Housewives, slaves sent on errands, retired soldiers, and children carrying marked tokens to redeem state-supplied loaves. As they waited, they talked, and the baker listened. One client grumbled about her neighbor's late-night visitor. Another whispered about grain shipments delayed at Ostia. Someone else spoke of a praetor seen leaving a brothel on the Aventine. The baker's shop was small, but it echoed with politics, scandal, desire, and fear. Bakers learned more than they let on, and some, wisely or foolishly, shared what they knew. A dropped word could spark a riot or earn a reward. Regulation, inspection, and paranoia. Bakers were closely monitored. Under Emperor Augustus, bread production became a matter of public order. The Corpus Pastorum, a guild of bakers, was both a privilege and a prison. Membership came with status but also obligations: quotas, quality checks, surprise inspections. A state inspector might show up unannounced, checking weights, measuring moisture, even tasting the bread. Too heavy a hand with ash or sawdust filler could result in fines or lashes. And yet, despite this scrutiny, many bakers flourished. Some grew rich. Others were co-opted by political factions, their ovens turned into hubs of quiet rebellion or imperial propaganda. The price of flour, the cost of silence. Rome's economy was fragile and bread prices could tip the scales between calm and chaos. When grain shipments failed, riots erupted. Bakers bore the brunt of public anger. Their shops could be torched, their workers beaten. And so, they watched the flow of grain like priests reading entrails. A shipment late from Alexandria. The baker would know before the governor. And in knowing, the baker had power. Some used that knowledge to prepare, others sold it, a few quietly vanished. The quiet pillars of the empire. It's tempting to see Rome in terms of its grand architecture and military triumphs. But it was these bakers, exhausted, grumbling, pragmatic, who truly held the city together. They understood hunger. They understood fear. And they knew, far better than most senators, what the people thought, needed, and whispered about. And perhaps this is why the emperors watched them so closely. Because a baker who knew what Rome wanted could stir more unrest than 100 pamphlets. And so, as the morning sun rose above the tiled rooftops, and loaves cooled in neat piles on stone counters, a question lingered in the steam of fresh bread. If Rome's bread makers could hear every secret, what did they choose to say? When you think of political espionage in ancient Rome, you might imagine spies in the Senate, Praetorian guards whispering behind marble columns, or ambitious generals passing coded letters across the frontier. But there was another kind of intelligence operation unfolding daily, quieter, steamier, dusted in flour. Rome's bakers, seemingly ordinary tradesmen, were uniquely positioned at the crossroads of information, necessity, and the imperial state. As their role evolved from humble millers to a professional class embedded in the logistics of empire, so too did their relationship with power and danger. Gilded and bound, the corpus pastorum. Sometime in the late 1st century BCE, Rome's bakers began to formalize. While tradesmen had always existed in clusters, blacksmiths, cobblers, dyers, the corpus pastorum, the bakers' guild, took on a special form. Under Augustus and later emperors, it was declared a collegium, a state-recognized association with rights and responsibilities. Membership became compulsory for professional bakers in Rome. The idea was simple: regulate the people who fed the city. But in practice, it became a form of lifetime conscription. Bakers could not simply stop baking. They could not pass on their shop to an unlicensed son-in-law. Their sons were expected to become bakers, and their properties could be seized by the guild if they failed in their duties. Even the state's language reflected this tension. A baker wasn't just a professional. He was a public servant of stomachs, a necessary cog in the machine of civil stability. Bread as propaganda. Emperors understood the power of bread. The panem in panem et circenses, bread in circuses, wasn't metaphorical. Grain distribution and access to bread were the most direct, visible signs of imperial care. Public anger over food shortages could quickly erupt into violent unrest. Aediles, public officials, and prefects responsible for the grain supply, Praefectus Annani, faced extreme pressure to maintain stability. If they failed, the crowd didn't storm the imperial palace, they burned bakeries first. Some emperors took extraordinary measures. Trajan, for instance, increased the free grain allotment. Septimius Severus added oil to the state distributions. Aurelian, in the 3rd century CE, began distributing free bread instead of just grain, ensuring that even the poorest citizen had access to finished loaves. This meant bakers weren't just tradesmen, they were conduits of imperial favor. Their loaves carried messages of control, benevolence, and sometimes desperation. The baker's ear, Intelligence by loaf. Inside a pistrinum, you might find sacks of grain labeled with Egyptian symbols, a milling donkey walking in endless circles, and a thin layer of flour dust settling on the ledgers of accounts owed and favors granted. But if you stayed long enough, if you became part of the shop's furniture, you might begin to notice the information flowing between customers, apprentices, and master bakers. Rome didn't have a formal intelligence network as we understand it today, but it had gossip, and gossip traveled best when wrapped in routine. Consider the baker Marcus Favonius Scaeva, whose name appears on stamped loaves found in Pompeii. His shop, located near the Forum, was well positioned to hear the murmurings of every class. While nothing scandalous survives in the archaeological record, his prominence suggests influence and connections. And while there's little in written history that attributes political schemes to bakers directly, several letters and graffiti suggest they were information brokers of a kind. Their customers came from all layers of society: slaves, freedmen, matrons, petty officials, merchants. This flow of chatter over time built a map of rumors that was more reliable than any Senate speech. A dangerous privilege, the price of listening. Of course, knowing too much could be lethal. The Emperor Domitian, reigned AD 196 CE, was notoriously paranoid. His reign saw an uptick in accusations of treason, often based on rumors or offhand remarks. Several minor officials were executed simply for repeating gossip. One baker in Subura, a working-class district, was reportedly arrested after his apprentice repeated a joke about the emperor's baldness. The apprentice was flogged. The baker disappeared from records. Was it a misunderstanding, a personal grudge, or a sign that Rome's leaders feared what the streets were saying? Regardless, the lesson was clear. You may listen but do not repeat, unless, of course, you're repeating it to the right ears. Some bakers learned to leverage their positions, feeding curated information to magistrates or local officials. In return, they might receive lighter inspection, access to better grain, or even protection from angry mobs during shortages. Others stayed silent. Flour, they believed, should be the only thing floating through the air. Bakers and the Great Fires. Fire was a constant threat in ancient Rome. With wood, oil, straw, and narrow alleys, even a small flame could consume entire blocks, and the pistrinum filled with open ovens, hot embers, and flammable sacks was often blamed. In the wake of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, Nero's regime imposed new restrictions on bakeries. Some sources suggest they were required to maintain water barrels. Others hint at new architectural codes, though enforcement was uneven. But suspicion lingered. Rumors spread that bakers may have been paid to keep their ovens burning during periods of tension, giving convenient cover to arsonists or agitators. While there's no hard evidence, the very idea speaks to how intimately woven bakers were into the mechanics of Roman crisis. The ghost loaves of Pompeii. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash, but preserved a unique snapshot of Roman daily life. Among the most stunning finds were carbonized loaves in bakery ovens, frozen mid-bake. In the house of the baker in Pompeii, one oven still held 81 loaves of stamped bread, all abandoned as the city fled. The loaves were dense and sectioned for easy breaking, some stamped CELER slave of QINTUS GRNIUS VERUS, others with the name MODSTUS. Even in disaster, branding mattered. The presence of so many loaves suggests bulk baking, perhaps for redistribution, state sale, or local markets. And it tells us that bakers weren't just feeding households. They were part of an enormous supply chain that ran through port cities, tax offices, and the imperial machine. Daily life in the flour trade. Let's step back from empire and think about one baker's daily reality. Wake before sunrise. Measure grain, assess spoilage. Check the donkey, is it lame today? Mix starter too sour, too weak. Stoke the oven, don't overfeed the fire. Deal with an impatient customer who swears his bread wasn't stamped yesterday. Pay the grain supplier, haggle over last week's moisture levels. Accept gossip as payment. Did you hear about the magistrate's son? Give credit to the widow and Insula V, she always pays, eventually. Smile at the prefect's steward, he's watching. Listen to your apprentices whisper jokes and pretend not to laugh. Repeat every day, for years, until your back gives out, your teeth rot, or your son takes over the shop. And through it all, you'll hear the city hum through open windows, through whispered quarrels, through flowery fingers handing over copper coins. From bread to bureaucracy. Over time, the baker's shop became more than a place of production. It became a node in the empire's soft infrastructure, as vital as a tax collector, as connected as a priest, and as closely watched as a dissident. Their knowledge wasn't always written down, but it existed folded into routines, buried beneath habits, and passed quietly from one shift to the next. Some bakers wielded this influence modestly. Others overreached and disappeared. A few, like Modestus and Celer, left only their names stamped into a loaf of bread. And yet, a question bakes itself into the crust of this history. Did the bakers shape Rome's stories, or were they simply the last to hear them before they burned? You now know that the baker in Rome wasn't just a man of dough and fire. He was something else, a watcher, a silent witness to the rise and crumble of an empire's daily rhythms. But in this final section of Story 1, we'll take a closer look at how these dusty tradesmen became minor titans of influence and survival in a society that barely wrote their names down. How did a profession so necessary, so tightly regulated, become a ghost in the historical record, its participants both everywhere and nowhere? And what happens when the entire weight of an empire balances not on marble columns but on a handful of loaves? The evolution of surveillance by flour. In a society built on hierarchy and information, the baker was a quiet equalizer. Romans may have believed in class distinctions, but bread didn't. Rich or poor, plebeian or patrician, everyone needed it. This shared dependence blurred social lines within the bakery. A senator's steward might stand beside a laundress. A scribe might line up with a butcher. All listened. All spoke. And the baker, he stored those whispers like he stored his flour in large, dusty jars that might someday feed a riot or bribe a censor. As bakeries multiplied across the empire, especially in provincial cities like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Ephesus, and Alexandria, their role as information hubs expanded. Local administrators often relied on non-official channels to assess public mood, and the baker's shop alongside the bathhouse and tavern became one such barometer. Some scholars even speculate that provincial governors and tax collectors employed bakery owners as informal observers. These men would note complaints about grain prices, resentment toward Rome, or religious unrest, information that was often more accurate than official reports. But this quiet power came with consequences. In times of rebellion, bakers were the first questioned, the first watched, and in some cases the first punished. The cost of silence in a noisy city. You might think that silence would protect the baker. After all, he wasn't writing pamphlets or stirring mobs. But silence in Rome could be just as dangerous as speech. By the 4th century CE, under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, the empire faced repeated food crises. Grain shipments faltered, especially as Roman control over Egypt and North Africa wavered. Prices spiked. People went hungry. In response, the state imposed price edicts infamously recorded in Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 CE. Bakers were expected to follow strict rules about cost, size, and ingredients. Violators were fined, imprisoned, or worse. Many bakeries closed. Others fled the city, abandoning their shops. The state responded with coercion, chaining baking to inheritance. A baker's son, by law, was a baker. A retired baker was not retired, just missing. In these late imperial decades, we see a profession under siege still vital, still monitored, but increasingly treated like a state utility, not a citizen-run trade. A baker could be punished for speaking, punished for silence, punished for quitting. Bread in the time of collapse. By the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire teetered, grain imports ceased to flow reliably. The once great Annona system broke down. Urban centers depopulated. Public baths grew cold. Forums turned into grazing fields. Yet in the archaeological layers, we still find bread stamps. We still see millstones, kneading troughs, and soot-blackened ovens. Why? Because even as Rome collapsed, the need for bread did not. The baker may no longer have been feeding the political machine, but he was still feeding the people. One late source, the 6th century historian Procopius, writes of Rome under Gothic siege, 537 CE during the Byzantine reconquest. The aqueducts were cut. Mills powered by water ceased functioning. What did Belisarius, the Byzantine general, do? He constructed hand mills and reassigned soldiers to grind grain. Even in war, even in siege, even when emperors fell, someone had to bake. Bakers beyond Rome, a legacy of obligation. The model of Roman baking didn't vanish. It was simply absorbed and adapted. In the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, baker guilds continued under imperial oversight. In Constantinople, public bread ovens were regulated tightly. The imperial palace even had its own imperial bakery, staffed by slaves, eunuchs, and professionals, complete with quotas and record-keeping. In medieval Europe, we find charters for bakers' guilds modeled loosely on Roman collegia. Some cities like Paris in the 13th century regulated bread weight and prices, echoing Roman controls. Even the idea of public ovens, available for communal use in times of scarcity, descended from Roman urban planning. Yet for all this continuity, the baker himself faded into the background. Few were named. Few left writings. Most simply worked, baked, listened, and died, leaving behind only their stamp on a loaf that archaeologists would someday marvel over. What the loaves remember. We do not know the personal stories of most Roman bakers. We have names, yes, Modestus, Celer, Scaeva. We have loaves blackened by ash or imprinted with commerce. We have walls where their ovens still cling to the corners of ancient kitchens. But we do not know their voices. And perhaps that's the final irony. For all the gossip they absorbed, all the whispers they heard, all the customers they served, the bakers did not write. Their hands were too full. Their legacy is one of absence of routine so well performed, it vanished into normalcy. No headlines, no speeches, no statues, just bread, just warmth, just continuity. The end of the oven, the start of the myth. Eventually, the guilds dissolved. The state no longer tracked loaves with such precision. Grain trade shifted to local markets, and the baker became once again an artisan, not a functionary. But in that long interim between the Republic and the late Empire, the Roman baker occupied a space that few ever truly recognized. He was a provider in a society obsessed with hierarchy. He was a listener in a city where speech could kill. He was an observer in an empire always watching itself. We know of the emperors because of coins. We know of the senators because of marble busts. We know of the soldiers because of triumphal arches. But the baker, we know him because of a carbonized loaf in a ruined oven. We know him because someone once stamped a name into bread and made it stick, not for power, not for legacy, but to make sure someone got the right loaf. That's the legacy of the Roman baker, not glory, not conquest. Precision, routine, warmth. And so the question remains, drifting like flour in the air. If a civilization is measured not by its heroes, but by those who fed them, what does it mean that we forgot their names? Story 2. The Silk Ledger Bureaucracy in Tang Dynasty China. Imagine walking through the narrow stone corridors of a government textile bureau in Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty. The air is thick with the dry scent of ink, lacquer, and silk dust. No music, no market calls, just the repetitive scratch of brushes on bamboo paper, and beneath it all the faint rustle of silk being counted, weighed, catalogued. It is the 8th century. China is the largest, most sophisticated empire in the world, and the hum of its glory depends not just on poets or generals, but on bureaucrats with calloused fingers and sore backs, hunched over ledgers recording bolts of silk. Welcome to the dusty but vital world of Tang Dynasty textile bureaucracy, a world where a crooked stitch could unmake a court ceremony, and a miscounted robe could send an official into exile. An empire sewn together. To understand the bureaucracy, one must first understand the product, silk. In Tang China, silk was not just clothing, it was currency. Taxes were often paid in silk, especially in regions where coinage was rare or inconvenient. Diplomacy. Gifts of embroidered silk were sent to Korean kingdoms, Tibetan allies, and Arab traders. Propaganda. Imperial robes, woven with dragon motifs and clouds, signaled divine legitimacy. Hierarchy. The type, color, and quality of silk one could wear were dictated by law. This ubiquity meant that the state didn't just produce silk, it regulated, measured, taxed, distributed, and punished infractions related to it. At the center of this intricate loom was the Textile Bureau, known as the Weaving Office or Silk and Cloth Section, a department buried within the Ministry of Revenue. The boring work that kept the court beautiful. Let's follow a mid-level scribe, surnamed Su, who worked in the weaving office in the year 738. Su's job was far from glamorous, but essential. His responsibilities included receiving silk bolts from state-run workshops or provincial deliveries, measuring width and length using standardized bamboo rods, recording fabric weight using bronze scales with imperial calibration, comparing samples to dyed color charts mandated by the Ministry of Rights, checking for flaws, knots, broken threads, dye smears, cataloging embroidery. Was the dragon properly formed? Did the lotus petals meet regulation count? For every robe ordered by the court, 2 to 5 bureaucrats were involved in its documentation. Some tracked materials, others handled requests from imperial tailors, still others performed quality assurance, and all of it had to be recorded in triplicate. If a robe failed inspection, it was not destroyed, it was downgraded, sometimes repurposed for lower-ranked officials, but the error would be noted and the official overseeing its production might be demoted. A single loose thread could become a career-ending scandal. Women behind the walls. While the bureaucracy was largely male, the actual weavers were often women, either indentured, criminally sentenced, or born into hereditary weaving households. In places like Suzhou and Luoyang, entire neighborhoods were dominated by textile workshops. These women worked in long shifts, bent over looms, often under the supervision of both overseers and court eunuchs. Most never saw the robes they helped create worn. Their names were rarely recorded, except in punishment logs. Yet they made the silk standards of Tang armies, the court gowns of imperial concubines, the diplomatic robes sent as far west as Baghdad. And each garment they produced passed through the fingers of men like Su, who documented every step of its journey. Ink-stained records and silk debts. Every day, new deliveries arrived from tributary states and provincial tax collectors. The Silk Ledger, a massive, stitch-bound document, tracked all entries. 8 bolts, crimson, Suzhou origin, plum blossom embroidery, slight damage on edge, accepted at reduced tax. 1 robe, dragon motif, imperial grade, sent to Ministry of Rights for mid-autumn ceremony. 4 bolts, yellow silk misdyed, returned to weavers with reprimand. Mistakes in these ledgers were taken seriously. A missing entry could mean theft. An overcounted robe could mean bribery. There were entire audit teams within the ministry who did spot checks, looking for inconsistencies. One famous case in 740, one involved a scribe who misrecorded silk weights to cover for a corrupt official. He was publicly flogged, stripped of rank, and exiled to the western frontier. Silk as surveillance. Because silk moved through the empire from palace to province and back, it became a quiet tool of imperial oversight. Officials were expected to wear specific silk grades, and reports were filed when violations occurred. Families that grew wealthy too quickly were sometimes investigated via their textile consumption. Provincial governors were required to submit annual silk tribute, and discrepancies were seen as signs of incompetence or rebellion. In essence, silk became a paper trail, not just in ledgers but in closets, chests, and shoulders. And the scribes in the weaving office. They were not just record keepers, but subtle instruments of imperial discipline. Monks, merchants, and silk loopholes. Outside the state system, there were others who dealt in silk. Monasteries. Buddhist temples often received tax exemptions and produced luxury silks for religious festivals. This angered some Confucian officials, who saw it as an economic distortion. Merchants. Black market silk, either stolen from workshops or misreported in transit, fueled an underground economy. Silk smugglers sometimes bribed low-level clerks to falsify reports. Foreign diplomats. Given robes as gifts, foreign emissaries often resold them in Western markets, where Tang silk fetched enormous value. All of this meant that Su and his colleagues had to be both accountants and detectives, scanning every roll for mismatched dye lots, forged markings, or suspicious delivery patterns. They did it all with no glory, no celebration, and typically no promotion. The dullness of empire's soft power. The Tang dynasty is remembered for poetry, calligraphy, and cultural openness. But it's the backroom bureaucrats, the silk scribes, the quality controllers, the silent ink-stained men who made that beauty possible. They were overworked, underpaid, and often blamed for failures far above their station. And yet, through it all, they kept the ledgers. They recorded gifts to the Lushan garrisons. They tracked the robes sent to Japanese envoys. They noted with care when the empress ordered a new shade of purple and how many bolts were used to achieve it. And when the dynasty began to crumble, when rebels marched on the capital and silk stockpiles were looted, it was these scribes who quietly tried to hide, protect, or burn the records. Because in those ledgers was the truth of an empire's wealth, its secrets, and its sins. So as we turn the pages of dusty chronicles, one can't help but wonder. If a robe traveled 2,000 miles from Suzhou to the emperor's back, how many forgotten hands recorded its every thread? In the corridors of power, it is easy to be distracted by marble, gold, and sword. But true empires, those that last, are built not just on conquest, but on calculation. In the Tang dynasty, calculation was often carried not on war horses or scrolls of law, but in bolts of silk stacked floor to ceiling in quiet offices behind lacquered doors. The weaving office was just one spoke in a massive administrative wheel, a bureaucracy so extensive that it could map human status and movement through fabric alone. But this was more than commerce. It was classification, visibility, enforcement. And to the Tang state, silk wasn't just a textile, it was an instrument of social engineering. Dressing the state, rank through texture. The Tang legal codes were explicit about clothing. Color, weave, pattern, and accessory were all tools for signaling one's place in society. And those distinctions were not optional, they were state policy, tightly regulated and meticulously enforced. Let's break down a few of the rules. Imperial yellow was reserved for the emperor and his immediate family. Purple denoted high-ranking court officials, particularly those within the upper 3 grades of the 9-rank system. Green and red robes marked mid-tier officials and certain military ranks. Commoners were restricted to undyed or lightly dyed fabric, primarily hemp or ramie, not silk. Failure to follow these laws could be interpreted as treasonous posturing. Simply wearing a forbidden dye, especially in court, was enough to trigger censure, fine, or demotion. Repeat offenses could result in banishment or forced labor. So the silk bureaucrats, like our scribes, weren't just measuring cloth. They were maintaining the hierarchy. Each robe, hat, and sash helped preserve the order of heaven and earth, at least in theory. Silk caste and censuses. Beyond rank, silk also served the government as a population tracking tool. Every 3 years, the Tang state conducted a household census, tracking births, deaths, relocations, and occupations. These tallies helped determine taxation and military service obligations. But in between censuses, another mechanism helped validate population movement: textile distribution and consumption. Local governments tracked how much silk or cloth a family could produce. Monasteries that received exemptions had to record how many robes they commissioned. Regions that sent silk tax had to account for every bolt, what dye was used, who wove it, which family paid it. This system allowed the state to spot anomalies. For example, a family reporting 3 adult males, but delivering only 2 robe tributes might be hiding a son from the draft. A village sending dyed silk above its known production capacity might be laundering black market bolts. In this way, cloth became census, and fabric became fingerprint. The looms of surveillance, a bureaucracy of threads. You might think of surveillance as a modern problem, but in Tang China, it was built right into the structure of governance. Each province had officials known as silk assessors, Chinese letter, responsible for checking the honesty and quality of silk collected. Their ledgers, in turn, were cross-referenced by revenue inspectors from the capital. The bureaucratic layers were as follows: weavers and household contributors, families or state workshops that produced cloth; local tallymen, who recorded amount, type, and condition; prefectural agents, who packaged shipments, inspected samples; transport monitors, who ensured bolts weren't stolen or swapped en route; Chang'an's weaving office clerks like Su, who performed the final inventory; central auditors, who periodically reviewed all records for discrepancies. In this elaborate system, fraud was difficult but not impossible. Some officials skimmed silk and replaced bolts with inferior stock. Others underreported defects, but the risk was high. As Tang law treated grain, salt, and silk as pillars of the imperial economy, crimes involving textiles could carry sentences ranging from heavy fines to beheading. The price of robes, the cost of status. Silk was wealth. It was not cheap to produce, and even more expensive to dye, embroider, or tailor into garments that passed court muster. Let's consider a simplified breakdown. 1 bolt of base silk, approx. 40 feet, equivalent in value to 3 months' pay for a laborer. A fully dyed and embroidered robe, enough to feed a family of 5 for 2 seasons. A minor official's annual clothing stipend. 4 bolts, often insufficient, requiring personal supplementation. This discrepancy led to multiple effects. Petty corruption officials might accept low-grade bolts as bribes, then report them as high quality. Second-hand silk trade robes were repurposed, resold, or redyed across class lines. Robe inflation: tailors and silk vendors raised prices during festivals or court promotions. And all of this passed through the weaving office. Every bolt submitted, every robe requisitioned, every report filed by hand. The state saw itself literally through silk. Silk roads and ledgers. While much of the weaving office's work focused on domestic matters, It was also intimately tied to international diplomacy. Envoys from Tibet, Goguryeo, Korea, Persia, Sassanids, Abbasid Caliphate, Japan, received gifts from the Tang court, nearly all of which included silk. These were not informal gestures. They were official transactions, documented in imperial archives. The robes and bolts were selected by bureaucrats, tagged with origin notes, and matched with the recipient's rank. Scribes like Su would record, to envoy Hassan ibn Khalid of the Caliphate, 3 bolts of cloud pattern brocade, deep indigo, Nanjing origin. 1 full-length robe, phoenix embroidery, appropriate to diplomatic protocol grade II. And then, follow-up reports tracked whether the envoy had accepted, returned, or regifted the materials. Silk was a diplomatic language, and the clerks were its silent translators. Decline by overthreading. By the 9th century, the Tang dynasty's grip weakened. Regional governors grew autonomous. The Lushan Rebellion 755–763 devastated northern cities, trade routes faltered, silk production declined. So too did trust in the textile bureaucracy. Several scandals rocked the Ministry of Revenue. A clerk in Luoyang was caught inserting blank pages into ledgers, delaying audits. Provincial assessors began accepting grain instead of silk, creating confusion in records. Some tax documents list families delivering non-standard cloth or unclassified bolts, signs of either desperation or defiance. Even within the weaving office, complaints mounted. Officials bemoaned backlogs of unprocessed inventory. Couriers demanded bribes to ensure robe deliveries arrived on time. The bureaucratic fabric, so carefully woven over generations, was fraying. Su's final entry. We don't know if Su, our imagined clerk, was real, but men like him certainly were. Silent, methodical, underappreciated. Perhaps his final entries read: 5 bolts rejected. Dyed incorrectly ordered deep vermilion received rust. Dye house fault. Empress Dowager requests expedited delivery of mourning robe. Assigned 2 tailors and scribe KO. Ledger bound and sealed, awaiting audit, ink low. And then nothing. No name etched in history, no statue, no poem. But the robe arrived. The ceremony went on. The emperor looked radiant. And somewhere behind the curtain, a clerk exhaled. Knowing the entry had been made, the numbers had aligned, and the silence of silk had once again preserved the illusion of perfect order. And so we must ask, when fabric is used to control people, and ledgers to weigh lives, was the state wearing robes, or were the robes wearing the state? By the late Tang dynasty, the grandeur of imperial China still shimmered, at least from a distance. Official processions in Chang'an paraded down regimented avenues. Dignitaries wore embroidered robes heavy with symbolism. Eunuchs and ministers exchanged ceremonial silks during court audiences. But beneath this show of order, the threads were beginning to pull apart. And no one knew this more than the scribes, tailors, weavers, and inspectors, who kept the empire's textile bureaucracy running. This final section of Story 2 traces how the quiet force of the Tang silk recordkeepers began to falter, not with rebellion or war, but under the soft pressure of complexity, corruption, and human fatigue. The paper behind the power. Throughout the height of the Tang era, silk bureaucracy was upheld by paperwork ledgers, receipts, comparative die charts, duty schedules. In the weaving office alone, at least 3 separate copies of each textile transaction were made. 1 for the Central Record Archive. 1 for the relevant ministry or department, e.g., Rights, War, Public Works. 1 retained by the weaving office itself. Each bolt of silk passed through a minimum of 6 recorded stages. Source documentation from the province or workshop. Entry log upon delivery at the capital. Physical inspection and grading. Measurement and tagging. distribution to court, military, or diplomatic recipient, certification of receipt and usage. Every misstep too long a delay. A mismatched hue, missing tailor's stamps could lead to inquiries, audits, or disciplinary notes. This system worked when the empire was stable. But as the dynasty grew increasingly strained by external threats and internal factionalism, the paperwork began to pile up faster than it could be managed. The Unlushan disruption, thread snapped. The Unlushan rebellion, 755–763 CE, was more than a military catastrophe. It was a bureaucratic shockwave. The rebels seized Luoyang and Chang'an, two major administrative and textile production centers. In doing so, they destroyed weaving facilities, looted for supplies, textile records, many of which were burned or repurposed for rebel use, tax networks, which broke under the pressure of disrupted communication. After the rebellion, the Tang court fled to the southwest. It attempted to rebuild, but the pre-rebellion bureaucracy had become impossible to restore fully. Many textile officials simply disappeared, killed, defected, or too afraid to return. Some scribes, like the now-lost official Wang Shao of the Southern Bureau, left behind half-completed records. One fragment from his ledger reads, "Robes requisitioned, 9 in total. 1 returned bloodstained, awaiting decision on whether to re-dye or dispose." No further entries were made. The eunuch era, silk as leverage. As imperial authority weakened, eunuchs rose in administrative power, especially in the palace and military. Many assumed control over textile distribution, bypassing traditional bureaucracies. These eunuchs controlled access to imperial robes and ceremonial garments, redirected silk tributes for their own patronage networks, appointed their own scribes and tailors, undermining the weaving office's role. In some cases, palace eunuchs sent silk gifts to military generals to secure loyalty, a practice once exclusively reserved for the emperor himself. The traditional bureaucrats, like our scribe Su's successors, found themselves sidelined. Their reports gathered dust. Their inspections were ignored. Silk flowed, but no longer through regulated channels. It was no longer just about order. It was about influence, forgery, waste, and the final ledgers. In this new era of decentralization and improvisation, forgeries proliferated. Officials faked textile stamps to claim rank or favors. Weavers began copying imperial motifs for private clients. Provinces sent inferior silks, labeled as premium grade to avoid penalties. A once meticulous system was now struggling under its own weight. Some clerks protested. One report from the mid-9th century laments, "The dragon embroidery lacks the requisite 9 coils, yet it has passed inspection. If such things proceed, the robe will be worn, but the dignity will be threadbare." Eventually, quality control became inconsistent. Tributes were delayed, sometimes lost. One shipment of silk to a Tibetan delegation was found rotting in storage due to mishandled ledgers. The matter was hushed. At this point, officials stopped trying to fix the system. They simply adjusted expectations downward. The quiet end of the ledger keepers. By the time the Tang dynasty collapsed in 907 CE, most textile records had ceased to be updated. The final entries in many archives are simple, tired lines. No deliveries received this quarter. Workshop burned, staff dismissed. Robes incomplete, audit postponed. No public funerals were held for the weaving office scribes. No monuments were erected for the women who wove for a dynasty that no longer needed them. Yet in archaeological digs near Chang'an, Luoyang, and Dunhuang, fragments of silk ledgers have been found, scraps of bamboo slips, paper sheets, and ink annotations. Some include tallies of colors, patterns, or robe distributions. Others include personal notes, names of tailors, dates of injury, small prayers for safe travel of silk caravans. Together, they offer a faint but powerful echo of a world where fabric was destiny, and a single mistaken stroke of a brush could shift the appearance of an entire court ceremony. Legacy in cloth and clay. The weaving office faded, but its impact lingered. In Song Dynasty China, textile regulation returned modeled in part on Tang systems. In Japan's Heian court, clothing codes were heavily influenced by Tang attire and textile classifications. In Islamic Spain and Abbasid Baghdad, Tang silks became collector items often re-embroidered with Arabic script, yet still bearing Chinese motifs. Even today, many surviving Tang textiles preserved in tombs, monasteries, or traded along the Silk Road retain their ledger stamps, often overlooked by viewers but crucial in their time. These small marks, barely legible, once told a story of who made the robe, where it came from, and who approved its use. A tiny square of ink, a silent bureaucrat's thumbprint, a system remembered only by its margins. So let us ask in closing, when the dynasty faded and the robes turned to dust, was it the silk that remembered the empire, or the empire that forgot the silk? Story 3. The dull wars of measuring salt, Europe's forgotten tax battles. When we think of war in European history, we imagine clashing swords, cannon fire, and dynastic betrayals. But there was another kind of war, quieter and longer, waged not on muddy battlefields but in tax offices, border posts, and salt warehouses. This is the story of how salt, a mineral so ordinary it often goes unnoticed, became one of Europe's most contentious, boring, yet essential battlegrounds for control, and how the act of measuring, weighing, and taxing salt gave rise to sprawling bureaucracies, local revolts, and some of the most tediously powerful laws ever written. In this first section, we step into the heart of the slow-burning conflict that brewed in pre-revolutionary France, where civil servants known as gabeless salt tax collectors measured not just salt, but obedience. Salt, the mineral that mattered. Salt has always been essential. In medieval and early modern Europe, it wasn't just a seasoning, it was a preservative, a currency, and sometimes even a religious symbol. Preservation. Before refrigeration, salt kept meat, fish, and cheese from spoiling. Trade. Salt routes connected inland towns to coasts, forming economic arteries that rivaled spice roads. Power. Whoever controlled salt controlled stability. Governments understood this, and so salt became a tax target, an item consumed by all, required by law, and easy to regulate. No country made this more complex or more hated than France, with its infamous gabelle, or salt tax. The gabelle, a tax without pity. Instituted in the 14th century under Philip VI, the gabelle quickly became one of the most reviled taxes in Europe. What made it so despised? Mandatory purchase. Every person over a certain age was required by law to buy a fixed amount of salt per year, even if they didn't need it. State monopoly. The government controlled salt production and sale. Private salt trading was banned. Regional inequality. France was divided into salt zones, each with different pricing and rules. A pound of salt could cost 4 times more in one province than in another. In some regions, like Anjou or Brittany, salt was nearly unaffordable for the poor. In others, like Lorraine, salt was cheaper due to different arrangements or historical exemptions. This bizarre patchwork created internal smuggling routes and a thriving black market, and gave rise to one of the most meticulous enforcement systems of the age. The gabeless, civil servants with scales. The gabeless, the salt tax agents, were not soldiers. They were paper pushers, record keepers, and inspectors, charged with managing state salt warehouses, greniers à sel, issuing receipts, and policing illegal salt trade. A typical day for a gabelou might involve inspecting local households to verify salt quotas were being met, weighing and recording sales in government salt shops, salt barns, questioning travelers at checkpoints, tallying regional salt usage, waste, and discrepancies. They wore simple uniforms, carried ledgers and scales, and were usually drawn from the middle classes men who had risen through local administration or purchased minor offices. Despite their modest appearance, they wielded serious power. A Gablu could search homes without a warrant, detain suspects, and impose fines. And their authority wasn't just legal, it was physical. Many salt inspectors were accompanied by armed guards or backed by regional bailiffs. Disputing a salt fine could lead to confiscation of property or jail time. The math of monarchy. The French monarchy relied heavily on salt revenue. At times, over 6% of all royal income came from the gabelle. This meant that quotas were strictly enforced. Audits were frequent. Officials were monitored, and so were their monitors. Each regional salt office was required to submit detailed reports monthly. Quantity sold, number of registered households, amount of missing salt due to theft, spillage, or error, individual account discrepancies. To maintain accuracy, salt was weighed using calibrated brass or iron weights, often engraved with the royal fleur-de-lis. And to prevent tampering, salt barns were sealed nightly with wax seals impressed by official rings. Any breakage without a supervisor present was a serious offense. Salt's movement from mine to mouth was charted like bullion. Smugglers of the salty underground. Where there is overregulation, there is resistance. Salt smuggling, or faux sonnage, became a national pastime in regions suffering under high gabelle rates. Families secretly traded small sacks of untaxed salt at night. Coastal communities boiled seawater illegally for home use. Women, especially widows and market vendors, played a key role hiding salt in clothing, baskets, and under layers of fish. Entire villages became known for their refusal to comply, sheltering smugglers and resisting inspections. And in many cases, gabelists were despised, pelted with mud, chased from towns, or quietly bribed to look the other way. By the 18th century, the Corps of Salt Guards had over 25,000 officers nationwide, yet smuggling persisted. Ledgers and rebellions. The gabelle sparked more than irritation. It fueled uprisings. In 1548, a revolt in Saintonge against salt taxation turned deadly, with thousands storming tax offices and killing collectors. In Brittany, salt riots occurred almost annually by the 17th century. Each time, the monarchy responded with harsh suppression, militias, executions, mass arrests. More bureaucracy, tighter controls, new forms, additional officers. This culminated in a paradox. The more the state tried to control salt, the more expensive it became to enforce the system. By the 1760s, salt-related arrests exceeded 100,000 annually, nearly 3,000 of which were children accused of smuggling. Many of these incidents were meticulously logged in judicial records. April 13, 1765, Jean L., age 11, caught with 2 pounds of undeclared salt, claimed to be carrying for mother. Sentence, 10 days confinement. Even these minor entries reveal a chilling fact. The war over salt was not metaphorical. It was real, and it was often waged against the poorest. A bureaucracy that turned on itself. As resistance grew, even the tax collectors began to chafe under the system. Some gabelists falsified ledgers to cover for missing salt. Others sold extra salt under the table, blaming spillage or miscount. Still others simply quit, unable to endure the isolation and hatred. In Paris and Versailles, reformers within the government began to question the wisdom of the gabelle. A few ministers proposed simplification, but each attempt was blocked by nobles or bureaucrats whose income depended on the existing complexity. By the 1780s, it was clear. The gabelle was a machine that fed itself, incapable of reform without tearing out its own gears. Salt as a revolutionary catalyst. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, the gabelle was front and center. In the Cahiers de Doléances, the lists of grievances sent to the Estates General by ordinary people, the salt tax was mentioned more than any other issue, including feudal labor and censorship. Within months, revolutionary leaders abolished the gabelle, and the salt barns were looted, their ledgers burned, their scales smashed. One account from a former clerk simply reads, "They took the salt, they burned the papers. I do not know what they want instead. I only know they hated the counting." It was an ending not with guns, but with silence, a silence where the ledgers used to live. So as we glance backward at this long, slow conflict over something so small and flavorless, we're left with a question as fine and sharp as a grain of salt. Was it the salt that made people rebel, or the fact that someone was always watching how much they used? As France choked on its gabelle, it was not alone. Across Europe, salt became one of the most persistently taxed and bureaucratically managed commodities in history. In some cases, the salt tax held empires together. In others, it silently frayed the trust between governed and governors, grain by grain. In this section, we take a slow and steady walk across European borders from Habsburg Austria to Tuscany, Venetian ports and British saltworks, to observe how salt's dull but critical administration shaped politics, labor, and even the invention of state paperwork itself. Austria, the salt mines of state control. Let us begin beneath the mountains. In the Austrian town of Hallstatt, miners had extracted salt since prehistoric times. By the 17th century, the region along with Salzburg, literally salt fortress, became a center of imperial salt production, tightly overseen by the Habsburg government. Austria implemented a system known as the Salzmonopol, salt monopoly, in which the state controlled all salt mining, production, and distribution. Citizens were not just encouraged but legally required to buy salt from state depots at fixed prices. What made the Austrian system unique was its combination of military precision and bureaucratic redundancy. The Salt Commission system. Salt commissioners, Salzbeamten, oversaw each mine and depot. Ledger officers recorded weight, moisture content, storage location, and time of extraction. All barrels were sealed with lead tags, bearing stamped dates and mine origin. State inspectors verified the rightness of the barrel weight, allowing for no more than 2% moisture variation. Every town had designated salt days when families lined up to receive their rations. These distributions were recorded in household salt books, Haushaltsbuch, stored in local parishes. To lose your salt book or to falsify it was a punishable offense. Clerks often noted the presence of children or absentees, marking down, left unclaimed, or received by neighbor with verbal witness. Venice and Genoa, maritime micromanagement. While inland empires taxed salt at point of origin, maritime republics like Venice and Genoa mastered the logistics of salt as a commodity in transit. Venice's approach. Venetians sourced salt from coastal evaporation ponds, especially Chioggia, south of the lagoon. Salt was then stored in state warehouses, some of which still stand today. Packaged into wooden barrels, each inspected, sealed, and branded with a ducal symbol. Issued to licensed wholesalers, who paid auction fees for distribution rights. Every transfer required debellentry record-keeping, one log for the seller, one for the buyer, both submitted to the Office of Salt Affairs, Officio del Sale. Clerks performed nightly reconciliations of barrel counts, noting down damage, shrinkage, or theft. A missing barrel could launch an entire administrative inquiry, involving warehouse keepers, transporters, and sometimes even gondoliers. Genoa's system was similar but included more private actors, with the Republic renting out production rights to noble families who then had to submit quarterly salt declarations. These reports included source of salt, local or imported, barrel weight, condition of staves and brine level, tax collected from final sale. Failure to submit a full report by the 5th day of the following month led to fines payable in salt, creating a recursive punishment loop. Tuscany, bureaucracy in the Grand Duchy. In Grand Ducal Tuscany, salt was used as a public revenue stream to fund civic projects, roads, fountains, and hospitals. Here, the salt tax bureaucracy was hyper-detailed. Every town had a salt registrar, a civil servant who held the keys to the salt barn, maintained a town salt book, Registro del Sale, certified salt scales weekly, tracked household consumption. Some towns took things further by assigning salt deputies, responsible for delivering salt directly to homes. Recipients signed or thumb-marked a receipt, and that slip was attached to a daily dispatch log. An entry from the town of Sartino, 1753, reads, Maria Niccolini, widow, received 1.5 liber. Child in her stead accepted the salt. Witnessed by Sister Lucrezia, convent midwife. Barrel number 42 checked by Pietro D., deputy. In other words, salt in Tuscany was not only a tax item, it became a micro-record of community life, a point where bureaucracy met intimacy. Britain, salt and the industrial shift. Across the Channel, England and later Britain approached salt differently, less through personal regulation and more through industrial control. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain's salt production was concentrated in Cheshire and Worcestershire, using brine pits and boiling houses. The British government taxed production, not personal consumption, making it a manufacturer-focused bureaucracy. Each producer had to register their salt pans with local tax offices, paid a duty per bushel, unit of measure, was subject to unannounced inspections of pans and storage barns. To enforce this, the government created a salt duty office which employed gaugers who measured volume of brine and output, excise officers who audited paperwork and issued penalties. One complication: salt was used in industries ranging from fisheries to leather tanning. Thus, many manufacturers petitioned for exemptions, and the bureaucracy ballooned with paperwork for special permits, rebates, and appeal documents. By the mid-1700s, salt duties were so disliked that some merchants simply refused to comply, leading to confiscation, court appearances, or, in some cases, factory shutdowns. And yet, despite the resistance, the tax persisted until 1825, when pressure from trade reformers led to its repeal. Salt as a language of the state. Across all these examples, salt taxation wasn't just about money. It became a language of record-keeping, a set of procedures and expectations that taught citizens what it meant to live under a modernizing state. Wherever it operated, salt administration imposed standardized measures defining weight and volume, official forms and seals setting bureaucratic precedent, identity tracking through household registries and receipts, legal literacy, as even peasants became familiar with salt quotas, exemptions, and complaint procedures. These dull but vital structures laid the groundwork for modern taxation, census, and civil registration systems. Salt, it turned out, was the gateway through which Europe learned to be governed. The workers behind the weight. Behind these systems were workers, clerks, porters, tacksmen, seal makers, coopers whose names we do not know, men who weighed the same sacks daily, women who recorded deliveries by lamplight, youths who carried brine barrels across slippery floors in exchange for coins and bread. They did not declare war, win revolutions, or write laws, But they kept the salt flowing, and in doing so, they kept the state breathing, even when that state forgot their names. Their work was not celebrated. It was routine, which is perhaps the most invisible kind of power. So next time you see a shaker of salt or a bag on a grocery shelf, consider this. What would it mean to weigh a mineral so carefully, so often, that it became a measure not of flavor but of trust, obedience, and the very function of the state? By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe's relationship with salt was beginning to change. Technological advances, political revolutions, and shifting economic theories all conspired to slowly dissolve centuries of rigid, paperwork-heavy control over a mineral once guarded like gold. But this unraveling did not happen in a dramatic sweep. Like the mineral itself, the decline of salt bureaucracy was slow, crystalline, and quietly corrosive, eroding the very forms of governance it had once helped define. In this final section, we examine how the salt tax systems collapsed across Europe, what they left behind, and how their administrative legacy endures in subtle, often invisible ways. Revolutions and repeals. France breaks the salt chain. The French Revolution of 1789 didn't just topple a monarchy, it also obliterated a bureaucracy. Among the very first acts of the National Assembly was the abolition of the gabelle, the infamous salt tax that had fueled centuries of anger and smuggling. On March 1, 1790, the decree was passed. Salt was declared free for all citizens, without quotas or purchase mandates. People wept, others danced. Many raided the salt barns not to steal but to burn the ledgers. Reports from the time describe villagers in the Vendée and Normandy ceremonially destroying salt scales and weighing tables, as if breaking a curse. For communities that had lived under the constant surveillance of gabeless, it wasn't just tax relief, it was a spiritual cleansing. And yet bureaucracy is hard to kill. The French government, strapped for funds during its revolutionary wars, reinstated a new salt tax in 1806, less severe, more commercially oriented but still enforced. Napoleon's regime needed salt for the army, especially for preserving food supplies, and so administration returned, though in a more centralized and militarized form. Even after the fall of Napoleon, the salt tax lingered. It would not be fully abolished in France until 1946. Yes, 1946. Britain's long boil, the salt duties fade. In Britain, public resistance to salt taxes took a slower form, not uprising, but economic argument. By the early 19th century, industrialists and reformers began to rally against the excise duty on salt. They argued that the tax raised the cost of food, especially for the poor. It hurt fisheries and livestock farmers, who depended on salt for preservation and feed. It punished manufacturers, especially soap and glass makers, who used salt chemically. One notable figure was Sir Thomas Bernard, a social reformer who publicly criticized the salt tax as a burden upon the entire food chain of the nation. Parliament debated, reports were written, and finally, after years of lobbying and shifting economic winds, the British salt duty was repealed in 1825. What followed was not chaos, but a quiet bureaucratic death. Salt pans were deregistered. Salt inspectors were dismissed or reassigned. Excise books were closed and archived. Some officials, like excise officer John Chapman in Cheshire, lamented in his final report, 33 years of watching the kettles. I weighed, I poured, I signed. Now no more. The barrels are untaxed, the salt unsealed. The ink dries and I do not know what to do. Austria and Italy, fragmentation and federation. The collapse of centralized salt systems in Austria and Italy followed the political fragmentation of the 19th century. In Austria, after the revolutions of 1848 and the rise of a constitutional government, salt taxes were gradually restructured. By the late 1860s, the monopoly model gave way to commercial licensing, reducing the need for household-level tracking and fixed rations. Italy, newly unified in the 1860s, inherited a patchwork of salt policies from its former kingdoms and duchies. The Kingdom of Sardinia had long favored state monopolies, while Tuscany and Lombardy had experimented with privatized regulation. To unify the system, the new Italian government imposed a national salt monopoly in 1862, not out of love for bureaucracy, but as a way to consolidate power and revenue. This remained in place until 1974, when Italy finally liberalized salt production and trade. By that time, the salt registers had already been absorbed into national tax archives, stored but rarely consulted. The bureaucrats who had once wielded measuring spoons like scepters now filed forms about income tax instead. The quiet aftermath, salt's lingering fingerprints. The administrative skeletons of salt taxation may have crumbled, but their legacy lives on in subtle, institutional ways. 1. Standardized weights and measures. Most European states refined their systems of weights, volumes, and currencies through their need to track salt accurately. Brass and iron standard weights used in salt barns became models for broader metrology. 2. Civil registration. The detailed household salt registries maintained in France, Tuscany, and Austria provided templates for early forms of civil population, tracking precursors to census systems and ID documentation. 3. Legal language. Modern tax codes and administrative law still use language shaped by centuries of salt regulation terms like excise, quota, monopoly license, declaration of consumption. 4. Bureaucratic culture. The expectation that governments should log, audit, and enforce everyday consumption of basic goods, be it tobacco, alcohol, fuel, or even data, has roots in salt. The structure of revenue collection still mimics the scale and ledger mindset of the salt age. Salt memory and forgetting. What makes the salt tax era so fascinating is not just its breadth, but how easily it was forgotten. Ask a modern citizen in Lyon, Genoa, or Salzburg about salt history, and you'll rarely hear mention of tax barns or salt clerks. And yet the buildings still stand converted into museums, libraries, or left to crumble quietly into stone. The clerks are gone, the ledgers are closed, but their fingerprints remain on the foundations of governance, tucked between census tables and archive folders. What made salt so powerful wasn't its flavor, it was its universality. Everyone needed it, and because everyone needed it, salt could be controlled, counted, and used as a mirror of the state's relationship with its people. Final thoughts, the last weigh-in. A clerk in Venice, a salt guard in Brittany, a barrel checker in Cheshire all lived lives bound by routine, regulation, and responsibility. They didn't lead revolutions. They didn't make discoveries, but they knew what it meant to hold power, not the power to rule, but the power to count. And that power, boring though it seemed, shaped Europe more than many kings or generals ever did. So next time you add salt to a dish, pause. You're not just seasoning food. You're participating in an act that once measured loyalty, poverty, legality, and rebellion. And the question still lingers in the shadows of old salt barn and closed archives. If the most powerful thing about salt was how much it had to be recorded, what does it mean when we stop keeping track? Story 4. Spoons, Spits, and Sanitation, Medieval Kitchen Codes. It's easy to imagine a medieval feast as a chaotic, gluttonous spectacle. Roasted boars with apples in their mouths, goblets overflowing with mead, minstrels playing to red-faced nobles tearing meat with their hands. But behind the noise and spectacle, something else was at work, something quieter, more meticulous, and far more boring. Rules. This is the story of how the great kitchens of medieval Europe, particularly in royal courts and noble manors, were governed by an elaborate web of codes, protocols, duties, and inspections. It's a story less about recipes and more about who washed the spoons, who lit the fires, and how the tripe was stored in summer. Because feeding a king wasn't a matter of taste, it was an institutional operation, and the kitchens were not only hot but hierarchical. The medieval kitchen, a military operation in wood and grease. In castles like Windsor, Avignon, or Chinon, the kitchen wasn't a cozy room with a fire. It was a complex, a cluster of rooms, storerooms, passageways, and courtyards, each with their own assigned function. Boiling house, for soups, stews, and boiling meats. Pastry room, for pies, often savory and reinforced with hard crusts that acted as containers. Scalding room, where game birds and pigs were cleaned. Pantry, for bread and dry goods. Larder, a cool, ventilated area for storing meats and fish. Spicery, a guarded chamber often locked, where imported spices were kept. Each of these spaces had its own staff, some of whom were clerks tasked with nothing more than logging how many eels arrived on Tuesday. At the center of it all was the master of the household, or in large institutions, a clerk of the kitchen, responsible for overseeing the operation and ensuring that every piece of poultry, pot of porridge, and bottle of wine passed through authorized hands. Food, labor, and logbooks. Let us picture a Wednesday in the summer of 1352 in the household of a mid-ranking English baron. A small feast is scheduled for visiting clergy. Here's what would be recorded. Arrival of ingredients. 2 hens live to be slaughtered. 3 pounds of barley. 1/4 of salt beef. Leeks, onions, garlic. 1 small barrel of ale. Spices from the spicery, recorded by separate keyholder. Preparation log. Scullion assigned to pluck and scald the birds. Cook instructed to boil barley for pottage. Kitchen boy sent to fetch trenchers. Stale bread used as plates. Inventory control. 1 copper pot signed out, serial number engraved, checked before and after use. Firewood usage logged by the porter. Waste tracking. Bones and offal to be recorded, either discarded, fed to hounds, or reserved for servants. All of this went into daily kitchen rolls, kept not for pleasure or efficiency, but because waste equaled theft, and theft was a serious crime, especially in food service. The problem of theft and spoilage. A common theme in medieval kitchen records is not cuisine, but crime. Kitchen workers, especially lower-ranking scullions and spit boys, were often accused of stealing food scraps, skimming portions from pots before serving, diluting wine and ale with water, feeding themselves with unauthorized ingredients. To combat this, noble households created strict codes of conduct. Locks on storerooms, keys held only by stewards. Tally systems for animal carcasses. Night inspections of pantries and meat hooks. Written oaths taken by staff swearing honesty in food handling. In some houses, leftover bread had to be counted the morning after a feast to verify that servants had not taken more than their allotment. The office of the spicery, measuring dust with authority. One of the strangest and most meticulous departments in a noble kitchen was the spicery, the room responsible for storing and distributing costly imported seasonings like pepper from India, saffron from Spain or southern France, ginger and cloves from Arabia via Venice, nutmeg rare and highly prized. The spicer was not a cook, but a logistics officer, often literate and responsible for daily entries that looked like this. On the Feast of St. Martin, 1 dram of pepper, a half dram ginger, 3 saffron threads dispensed to cook for fish stew. Receipt signed by Cook Thomas. Spice chest relocked. Why so much paperwork for such small quantities? Because spices were status symbols and highly theft-prone. A handful of saffron could be worth a week's wages. Stealing it was considered felony theft in some courts. Cutlery, cleanliness, and the spoon inspectors. Contrary to the popular image of medieval diners eating with their hands, spoons were common, especially in courtly households. Knives were personal items, and forks were rare, arriving later in the Renaissance. But the communal spoon was often provided and often audited. Yes, audited. Some large kitchens employed utensil clerks, responsible for counting spoons before and after meals, noting cracks, burns, or warping, logging which guests returned their assigned utensils. Why? Because losing a spoon wasn't just wasteful, it implied a guest had stolen it, disrespect, dropped it, improper manners, been poisoned and collapsed. Yes, this happened. In the English Royal Household Ordinances of 1479, a section is devoted to the silverware chest and its daily lock-in procedures, including spoon-by-spoon logging with a witness. Sanitation by custom, not science. It would be false to claim medieval kitchens were hygienic by modern standards, but they did have systems, guided more by religious custom, fear of rot, and practical experience than germ theory. Key practices included rotational cleaning of boiling pots in ash and vinegar, boiling water over chopping boards weekly, inspecting meat for bad humors, discoloration, or stench, dry salting fish and hanging it in ventilated larders, burning used straw from kitchen floors to avoid vermin buildup. In England and France, royal ordinances specified maximum holding times for certain meats. Pork 2 days in summer, fowl 1 day, beef up to 4 days if salted. Non-compliance meant punishment, which could range from dock of pay to kitchen flogging. In some monastic kitchens, repeat offenses resulted in silent meals as penance. Kitchen hierarchies and the medieval food chain. A royal or noble kitchen was also a rigid hierarchy, not unlike a miniature kingdom. Clerk of the kitchen, top authority over provisioning and record-keeping. Master cook, directed actual food preparation. Sous cooks, oversaw specific areas: soups, roasts, pastries. Scullions, cleaned pots, floors, and handled waste. Spit boys, turned roasting spits often for hours at a time. Pantlers and butlers, managed bread and wine respectively. Larderers, guarded and cut meat. Each position came with specific robes, portions of food, and punishments. Some roles were hereditary in great households. Others could be purchased or appointed via patronage. A detailed English kitchen roll from 1381 records. John Turner of the Spit missed 3 turns during roast of goose, portion halved, warning issued, his brother to resume duties tomorrow. Every roll had a log, and every mistake left a mark. When the fire goes out. At the end of each day, especially after a feast, the kitchen's firemaster oversaw the quenching of the hearth, a ceremonial and practical task. Firewood totals were logged. Unused ingredients were returned to their stores. Spices were recounted and relocked. Spoons were returned and checked. Then the daily ledger was sealed, signed by a steward or clerk, and archived. These records, some of which survive in dusty manuscripts and castle archives, reveal a world where hospitality was enforced by administration, and a soup pot was more surveilled than a sword rack. And so we're left with a question in the flickering glow of the last kitchen fire. If every spoon was counted and every scrap of meat logged, was it nourishment, or was it control, that really filled the halls of medieval power? In the grand halls of medieval castles, food reflected power. But beyond the royal court and noble manor, another vast and equally structured kitchen network ruled the daily lives of thousands. The kitchens of monasteries, hospitals, and military orders. While less opulent than courtly feasts, these kitchens were governed by rules that were just as meticulous, if not more so. Whether feeding monks in silence or feeding lepers with carefully weighed soup portions, the kitchens of these institutions operated under systems of accountability, proportion, and hierarchy that could rival a bishop's treasury. In this second section, we peer into these quieter kitchens built not for splendor, but for sustenance, order, and moral duty. Monastic kitchens, simplicity by regulation. In Benedictine monasteries, kitchens were not spaces of improvisation. They were expressions of the rule, specifically the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and enforced with minor variations for centuries. Under these rules, meals were to be simple. Portions were to be equal, except for the sick and elderly. Meals were often consumed in silence, while a monk read scripture aloud. Meat was largely forbidden, except for the ill. This led to one of the most consistent and finely tuned food systems in medieval Europe. Typical meal provisions for a monk per day: 1 pound of bread, a half pint of wine or beer, vegetable pottage seasonal, cheese or legumes, fruit when available. But these were not just suggested portions. They were logged and tracked by the cellarer, the monk responsible for provisioning. In large monasteries like Cluny or Monte Cassino, the cellarer maintained detailed inventories of food stores, including entries such as Lent 1247, 98 sacks barley, 31 sacks onions, 9 barrels dried fish, cheese portions for 83 brethren to be cut on Thursdays. Records also noted who received additional rations: sick monks, guests, or laborers. In some cases, scribes used tally sticks to track distribution, a simple but effective accounting method. The office of the cellarer, faith meets filing. The cellarer was not a cook. He was a logistics officer expected to monitor storerooms, negotiate food purchases, supervise servants, audit food waste. Monastic documents reveal a surprisingly robust system of food management. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, surviving account rolls list: 33 hens delivered at Easter, 11 cheeses spoiled mice infestation, reported to prior, barrels of wine arrived from France stamped, sealed, stored. One cellarer's account ends with a humble note: bread overbaked, scullions spoken to, no waste permitted on Feast of St. Martin. Even failure became part of the record. Hospitals and alms kitchens, the measurement of mercy. Beyond the cloister walls, kitchens fed not monks but the poor, sick, and dying. In cities like Paris, Florence, and London, medieval hospitals were less medical centers than almsgiving institutions. Their kitchens were busy, disciplined, and deeply moral in focus. At the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, daily food service followed rules based on social rank: nobles in private rooms, poor in wards. Medical condition: the sick were weighed and assessed for strength. Religious calendar: meat banned during Lent. Kitchen rolls from the 14th century describe portion soups, often ladled by the quart. Gruel recipes, adjusted for fevers and digestion. Distribution schedules to patients, staff, and pilgrims. These rolls include minute details: Tuesday 118 measures served, 4 refused due to spoilage, steward summoned, pot relined with iron patch before vespers. Measuring mercy: the spoon as a scale. In some institutions, especially in Italy and the Low Countries, standardized ladles and spoons were made of bronze or pewter and engraved with the hospital's crest and size unit. These tools were used not just to serve, but to verify fairness. Inspectors would spot-check ladles and compare them to official molds. Any deviation might result in replacement of the vessel, disciplinary action for staff, reports sent to ecclesiastical authorities. This was not about hospitality, it was about justice, measured 1 scoop at a time. The rule of silence: and the sound of the kitchen. Monastic and hospital kitchens operated under a special kind of tension. They were the only noisy spaces in otherwise quiet institutions. While monks prayed, scribes copied texts, and patients lay in beds, the kitchen clanged, boiled, and scraped. To control this, some monasteries appointed a kitchen sub-prior to enforce decorum. Reports from Chartres Abbey note a rule that no laughter, song, or idle speech shall proceed from the kitchen between terce and none. Violators were required to clean grease traps or latrines, as penance, a reminder that in sacred spaces, even soup must be solemn. Military orders and feeding the warriors of faith. Not all institutional kitchens were quiet. The Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and other crusading orders maintained massive kitchens to feed both soldiers and the poor. At a Templar preceptory, a daily meal might require 200 loaves of bread, 60 pounds of salted pork, dozens of pottage cauldrons, casks of wine or ale. Each meal was logged by the almoner, who oversaw food for the poor, the marshal, who checked soldier rations, kitchen clerks, who updated daily rolls with consumption numbers. Even on campaign, these logs were maintained, sometimes on parchment, sometimes with chalk or ink slates later copied into formal rolls. One surviving Templar roll from 1290 reads, "Rations short at acre, lentils doubled, bread from 3 days prior issued with warning, beer barrel damaged in transit, marked spoiled. Feast days and food overload." Though monastic and hospital kitchens were regulated, feast days often brought scale and complexity. Christmas, Easter, and Saints, feast days required larger meals. Records show roasts, sweet pastries, and imported wine. Scribes kept special feast rolls to log what was served, how much, and to whom. Some rolls even included names of all guests, like royal officials, bishops, or merchants, each assigned a meal tier. Feast of All Saints, 1327, 219 total served. Guest table, venison pie, almond custard. Lay brother table, beans, rye bread. Poorhouse, fish stew. These entries helped ensure gifts and donations were tracked, guests remembered, and leftovers accounted for. For institutions reliant on public trust and noble patronage, this documentation was survival. The kitchen as mirror. In these institutional kitchens, we see a quiet truth. They weren't just feeding bodies, they were feeding systems. Each ladle served reflected moral obligation, religious discipline, economic calculation, and each record every note about a spoiled cheese, a burnt porridge, a missing onion sack became part of a living archive of how people cared, failed, corrected, and endured. The cook did not serve alone. He was backed by a network of scribes, stewards, and statutes, and often by monks who believed that feeding the hungry could be just as sacred as prayer. So we close this section with a spoon in hand and ask, when a bowl of soup was measured by the ounce, the day, and the rank, was it nourishment or bureaucracy that truly sustained the soul? By now, the image of the medieval kitchen may feel transformed. No longer a roaring, chaotic den of roasted hares and shouted orders, it has revealed itself as a machine of procedures, a series of rooms where bread, broth, and bureaucracy shared equal space. And in this final section, we step into the slow, meticulous rhythm of inspection and enforcement, the health code of its time. Because while no germ theory yet explained disease, medieval institutions, royal, religious, and charitable, developed their own systems of accountability, hygiene, and punishment, all written down with impressive regularity. The result was a world in which cleanliness and obedience were intertwined, and where a dirty ladle could be a moral failing. Kitchen inspections, the quiet power of the steward. Throughout medieval Europe, especially in noble households and religious orders, inspections were routine, typically performed by the steward, chief household officer, the seneschal, responsible for broader estate management, an appointed clerk for logging observations. These inspections were scheduled, but sometimes unannounced and focused on cleanliness of pots, floors, and surfaces. Inventory verification, were 20 knives still accounted for? Had spices been tampered with? Condition of food stores, especially fish, meats, and dried goods. Staff conduct, was a cook drunk? Were spoons returned? Had rules been broken? The results were written into household rolls, which tracked disciplinary notes alongside meal preparation logs. Many survive in fragmentary Latin or Anglo-Norman entries. One from a 14th century estate reads, "The scullion left refuse in the yard after vespers. The larder smelled of pork turned, 2 pots scorched. The pantry tally was accurate. The steward was not amused." The dull language reveals the depth of seriousness. Food was trust, spoilage was betrayal. Punishments, from grease to gallows almost. The consequences of kitchen misconduct varied depending on the offense and the institution. Minor offenses: late to fire duty, right arrow, loss of bread portion. Unwashed hands noted at ladle, right arrow, extra labor cleaning privies. Swearing in kitchen during Lenten prep, right arrow, penance monks. Warning, lay staff. Major offenses: theft of spices or meat, right arrow, imprisonment, whipping or fines. Repeated inventory falsification, right arrow, dismissal. Causing food poisoning, even unknowingly, right arrow, expulsion or worse. At monasteries, moral failure in the kitchen often led to public apology in the refectory, sometimes barefoot, before a meal. In noble houses, some cooks were branded as untrustworthy, in roles damning them in the eyes of other employers. A bad record might travel by messenger or rumor. The hidden burden: women in the kitchen economy. While most official kitchen posts in courtly and monastic records were held by men, women were central to food preparation in less documented spaces. Small manors, urban households, hospitals, and leper houses. These women, often servants or laborers, bore the brunt of scalds, burns, and blame. Yet their work was infrequently recorded unless something went wrong. For example, in a London hospital ledger from 1379, Martha, kitchen maid, did not boil gruel to completion. For sick took ill, she was dismissed. Ale pot broken in her fall. No name for the sick, no reflection on the system, just the notation of error and removal. Despite their invisibility in many records, these women preserved institutional function, turning grain to gruel, stale bread to stew, and leftovers to charity portions. Their impact, like much of medieval women's labor, was measured only by its absence. Food as power, kitchens as politics. The kitchen was not neutral. Food could be withheld or increased based on favor, class, or clerical mood. A servant might receive extra broth for good conduct, or be denied wine for a small infraction. Records from the Burgundian court show that favorites at court received treat portions, during feast days additional meats, sweetened wine, and foreign fruits, while others were given standard fare. These extra items were logged meticulously, often with marginal notes like, "By command of the Duchess, cherry tarts added for Lord J." In monasteries, penitents received watery pottage, logged separately from main meals. Even in charity kitchens, wealthier donors were served better food than poor pilgrims, partly for politics, partly for practical thanks. In this sense, kitchens were like parchment, they remembered rank. The transition to modern food codes. As Europe moved toward the early modern period, kitchen record-keeping became even more formalized. Printed kitchen manuals emerged, including hygiene sections. Royal ordinances, like those of Henry VIII, included chapters on pantry and buttery conduct. Portion control, especially in military kitchens, became crucial in the age of standing armies. One 16th century document from the Spanish court details meat inspection charts, daily butter measurements, and authorized spoon sizes by rank. Though humorous today, these were serious matters. Spoon size determined eating pace and status. Too large and one was seen as greedy. Too small and it was a waste of precious stew. The kitchen clerk's final role. By the late Middle Ages, many great kitchens had a dedicated record keeper, whose only job was to write down what happened. They didn't stir pots or carve meat, they wrote. They copied butcher invoices. They tracked vegetable harvests for the kitchen garden. They maintained rosters of firewood usage, water barrels, and spice dispersals. They filed complaints, commendations, and disciplinary notes. These men, buried in grease-stained robes and surrounded by wax tablets and dull ink, created the unofficial diaries of medieval kitchens. Thanks to them, we know how many loaves were baked on Easter. We know who forgot to clean the eel vat. We know which ladle was used for what. And we know that no meal, no matter how grand or humble, escaped the record. Last reflections, the kitchen as a quiet power. The great political events of the Middle Ages, the signing of charters, the coronations, the battles are etched in stone and song. But in the background, every day, the kitchens boiled. They fed kings and paupers. They generated rules and wrote histories of the mundane. They taught Europe how to track, portion, measure, and clean. The Middle Ages may not have understood bacteria, but they understood failure. And so they responded with systems, built not just on fear of waste, but on belief that order even in a bowl of soup was sacred. So as the final cook banked the hearth, and the steward sealed the ledger with wax, one last thought lingers. If cleanliness was next to godliness, and every spoon had its scribe, was the kitchen the true cathedral of medieval life? Story 5. How the British Empire counted trees and lost track. When you think of empire, you may imagine soldiers, flags, or bustling ports. But often, control did not begin at a battlefield or a dock, it began in a forest. This is the story of how, in the 19th century, the British Empire turned trees into columns of data. It is a story of men who were trained not to conquer, but to classify, measure, and inventory nature. In doing so, they developed one of the most extensive bureaucracies the world had seen, not to govern people at first, but to manage forests, one tree at a time. By the end of the empire's reach, nearly every forest in colonial India was mapped, regulated, taxed, and on paper, at least saved. The irony is that in trying to control nature, the empire lost track of it entirely. The roots of bureaucracy, early British anxiety over trees. The concern began with shipbuilding. By the late 1700s, the British Royal Navy required vast quantities of oak, teak, and pine. Back home, England's ancient woodlands had been depleted, and reliance on foreign timber, especially from the Baltic, posed strategic risks. India, already under increasing East India Company control, presented itself as a solution. Here, forests stretched seemingly endlessly across the subcontinent, from the teak jungles of Burma to the deodar stands of the Himalayas. But appearances deceived. Teak, especially the kind suited for ship hulls, grew slowly, and indiscriminate logging had already begun to affect supply. To prevent wanton felling, the East India Company initiated timber regulations in the 1800s, at first informal, then formalized. Trees, for the first time, became an administrative concern. Enter the forester, measuring trees in the imperial manner. In 1856, the British officially established the Imperial Forest Department in India, headed by a Prussian-born officer named Dietrich Brandes. Brandes had previously worked in Burma, where he had introduced forestry practices learned from German scientific forestry. His appointment marked a pivotal shift. from ad hoc logging to systematic, planned, rotational forestry. Brandy's mandate was to survey and classify all forest lands, create forest reserves where cutting would be limited or forbidden, train native forest rangers in measurement and conservation, implement a permit system for local use, firewood, grazing, minor forest produce. This required a tidal wave of record keeping. Forest officers were issued logbooks in which they noted species and estimated age of trees, girth, height, and volume calculations, condition of undergrowth, presence of animals, pests, or signs of illegal activity. One such record from the Upper Ganges Division, dated 1873, reads, Section 12B, 240 teak trees above 60 years, 4 felled approved, 1 suspected illicit felling near stream axe marks noted, grazing permitted, 12 head of cattle under pass 212. Every entry was dated, signed, and filed upward through the hierarchy. The manuals, Forest Science as Scriptural Doctrine. To ensure uniformity, British administrators in India compiled forestry manuals texts that were used in schools, field camps, and civil service training centers. These included species classification charts, Latin name, native name, commercial value, tree age estimation guides based on ring counts, bark texture, and height, standard felling cycles, often 30 to 100 years, depending on species. For example, the 1883 Manual for the Operations of Forest Surveyors instructs: divide each reserve into blocks of 1 mile square. Mark each tree exceeding 6 inches in girth with red ink on ledger map. Number accordingly. Review every 5 years. This methodical approach borrowed directly from German bureaucratic forestry, where nature was no longer wilderness, it was a chartable asset. The permit, a paper leaf for every tree. No tree was to be felled without a permit. Local villagers, many of whom had used forest wood for generations, now had to apply at district forest offices, specify the type of wood, purpose, and volume needed, pay a fee or exchange labor, await approval, often for weeks. The result: long lines, frustrated peasants, and paper trails for firewood. Forest rangers tracked who had applied, how many trees they had permission to cut, and if they followed protocol. Permits were sometimes marked with thumbprints of illiterate applicants. One surviving permit from 1891 reads, granted to Ram Singh of Babua village, right to cut 2 sal trees, girth 2 ft3 in est, age 45 ers for agricultural implement use, valid for 30 days, area, Block 5A, Inspector, L.W. Hutchins. Resistance: when trees belong to memory, not ledgers. For many communities, forests were not resources, they were homes, temples, and stories. Colonial forest policy criminalized practices that had existed for centuries. Grazing cattle in certain clearings, gathering herbs, honey, or fruit, using fallen timber without official sanction. This led to a sharp rise in illegal activity, not because people were malicious, but because they refused to reframe forests as columns in a ledger. In response, forest officials increasingly relied on local informants, spies, and punitive fines. A 1904 incident in the Cumon Hills tells the story of a widow who collected 3 dry branches for cooking. She was fined the equivalent of 2 days' wages and warned in writing. The forest ranger noted. Subject expressed sorrow but ignorance, claims she did not understand permit limits, let off with caution. What isn't recorded? Her expression, her reasoning, or the 1,000 similar incidents across the empire. The forest maps, nature as geometry. To support this growing bureaucracy, the British produced detailed maps of every reserve. These maps weren't about topography or ecology. They were about boundaries and blocks. Forests were divided into compartments, labeled A1, A2, B1, etc. Each compartment had a rotation cycle years during which trees could be cut, left to regrow, or monitored. Maps included symbols for wells, roads, and ranger huts. The forest became grids on paper, detached from its ecological or cultural reality. One map from the Central Provinces in 1887 shows Compartment E3, felling year 1889, regrowth target 1909. Animal sightings, none since 1882. Suggested planting, bamboo. In some cases, trees were planted purely to fulfill quotas for logs, regardless of ecosystem compatibility. Teak and eucalyptus were introduced into areas where they displaced native biodiversity. But the forms were filled, the goals were met, and the bureaucrats were satisfied. Closing this section, when nature became numbered. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire's forestry bureaucracy was a model of paper precision. Every tree had a number, every block a plan, and every ranger a ledger. But questions lingered, questions no manual could answer. How do you measure a tree's place in a community, not just its girth? Can centuries of oral tradition about forests be translated into maps and forms? And what happens when the paper is right but the forest is wrong? The British had built a system where control was based on what could be counted. But in doing so, they began to lose sight of what couldn't be: relationships, rituals, resilience. So we end this section with a leaf pressed between the pages of an imperial report, asking, if every tree has a number but no name, is it still part of a forest or just a column on a page? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire's forestry project had matured into a vast, meticulously documented structure. Forests once wild, lived in, and spiritually linked to local life were now managed ecosystems of accounting and scheduling. The files grew thicker, the maps more detailed, every leaf fell into a category, and every patch of land was assigned a purpose. But even as the machinery of measurement became more efficient, cracks began to appear. Trees were being planted but not always growing. Local resentment smoldered, and within the empire's own bureaucracy, a quiet question was emerging. Was the data telling the truth, or just comforting lies? The rise of the Forest Report. By the 1890s, every colonial forest department from India to Burma to Ceylon was required to submit annual forest reports. These reports tracked total timber extracted in tons or cubic meters, revenue collected from permits and leases, number of fires, thefts, or encroachments, volume of new plantations established, staff changes, punishments, and promotions. The reports were dry but strangely rhythmic. A sample from the 1901 Punjab Forest Report notes, Sal harvesting in Block 9 yielded 4,331 cubic feet. Revenue from grazing, Rs. 281. 2 illegal fellings noted near Nirpur. No epidemic in nursery. Weather drier than average. Officer in charge commended. These documents were metrics of success, and they shaped policy decisions made in London, often by officials who had never walked under the canopy of a sal grove or eucalyptus line. But herein lay the danger. The empire had built an illusion of control, supported not by healthy forests, but by the belief in paper forests, reports, and maps that reflected intentions more than realities. The plantation obsession, trees without forest. As logging intensified and natural forest cover dwindled, forest officers were pressured to show replenishment. The solution: plantations, especially of fast-growing, commercially valuable species like teak, eucalyptus, and acacia. These plantations had several advantages: easy to measure, row, spacing, survival rates, predictable harvest cycles, appeared well managed in reports, but they also had serious ecological consequences. Loss of native biodiversity. Indigenous trees and undergrowth were often cleared entirely. Altered water tables. Eucalyptus, in particular, consumed enormous amounts of groundwater. Resistance from locals. People found plantations hard to use, dense, restricted, unfamiliar. A ranger from Madras noted in 1912, "The new teak block grows steadily. Villagers complain they cannot graze or collect minor produce. They call it the useless forest." In many cases, the new forests were silent, no bird song, few animals, and little human activity. But they looked neat, and in the ledgers they counted. Clerks in counting. The rise of the forest record room. Behind every ranger with a ruler was a clerk with a pen. The British forest bureaucracy became a paper industry unto itself. In regional forest headquarters, entire rooms were devoted to ledgers of tree counts by compartment and species, permit stubs, renewal records and violation notices, fire incident logs, rainfall charts and nursery mortality tables, minute books of ranger meetings and training schedules. Some clerks became legends in their own right, not for field work, but for their perfect handwriting, ledger discipline, or uncanny memory for plot numbers. In Bengal, an officer named Chatterjee Babu was known for maintaining 32 consecutive volumes of plantation registers, without a single ink blot. One visiting inspector wrote, "Though he has never felled a tree himself, the man knows the girth of every teak in reserve. He is a forest unto himself." Locals as tools. The tension of forest labor. Forests required labor, and that labor came primarily from local communities, often tribal or rural populations with long histories of living in and with the woods. But now they worked not as stewards, but as contracted laborers. Digging trenches for fire breaks, planting saplings in straight lines, clearing underbrush according to rotation plans, patrolling reserves as low-paid forest guards. Their own forest knowledge, seasonal rhythms, medicinal plants, wildlife behavior was largely ignored. A report from the United Provinces in 1920 notes, "Local tribes are used for planting and cutting. Some have superstitions about certain groves. Discipline required. Must ensure compliance with trench spacing protocol." In other words, ancient belief systems and environmental insight were seen as obstacles to bureaucratic order. When trees were lost on paper, despite all the forms, forests began to disappear. Between 1880 and 1930, deforestation rates in colonial India were among the highest in the world. Overharvesting, plantation monocultures, and restricted traditional use led to erosion and landslides, especially in the Himalayas. Depleted wildlife as habitats shrank. Increased forest fires, poorly controlled due to inadequate patrols. Reports often masked the decline. For instance, a 1928 report from Burma might show gross forest area, 3.2 million acres. Total timber extracted, 400,000 tons. New planting, 200,000 saplings. Revenue increase, 11%. What it doesn't say, nearly half of those saplings didn't survive, and the revenue came at the cost of local protests and land displacement. But the numbers looked good, and in the world of colonial governance, that was often enough. The Great Paper Forest, an empire of illusions. By the 1930s, British colonial forestry had become a bureaucracy nearly detached from its subject. Reports were written to please superiors. Maps were updated even when on-the-ground surveys lagged. Success was measured in volume cut and revenue, earned not forest health or community harmony. A senior officer in 1936 confessed, in a private letter, "We have perhaps built a great cathedral of forestry stone by stone, measure by measure, but we may have mistaken the blueprint for the cathedral itself. Closing this section, the echo of trees miscounted. The British Empire counted trees. It assigned them value, rotation, and space in a ledger. But forests are not rows of numbers, they are. Memory passed through generations. Symbiosis between flora, fauna, and humans. Uncertainty, shaped by wind, monsoon, and time. As paper forests grew, real ones thinned. And in that gap lies the story of an empire that tried to master nature with formality and ended up mistaking form for forest. So we leave this section with a brittle ledger page from 1927, its ink faded and its figures still legible. What matters more, what was recorded, or what was lost in the act of recording? The empire is gone, the flags have been folded, the forests returned at least in name to independent nations, but the systems the British created to manage trees have not disappeared. They evolved, they adapted. In some cases, they still define how forests are governed today. In this final section, we look at the quiet survival of colonial forestry, its tools, its mindset, and its consequences. Not just in South Asia, but across the many lands once labeled pink on the map. Because when the empire ended, the ledgers didn't burn. They were archived, translated, photocopied, and sometimes digitized, ready to serve new administrators, new ideologies, and the same old compulsion to quantify the unquantifiable. Independent nations, inherited systems. When India gained independence in 1947, it also inherited the Imperial Forest Department, the forest codes, and the reserve system. These structures were efficient, familiar, and deeply entrenched. So rather than discard them, the new nation-state renamed the department to the Indian Forest Service, IFS, retained the forest classification system, reserved forests, protected forests, and village forests, continued the practice of block mapping, permit issuance, and officer hierarchies. Many former British forestry manuals were reprinted with minor edits. The same girth charts, the same harvest cycles, the same rotational principles. This was not just in India. In Kenya, post-colonial forestry retained compartmental zoning. In Malaysia, the British introduced Forest Reserve Acts remained largely unchanged for decades. In Nigeria, eucalyptus plantations and imperial legacy still dotted the landscape. In every case, the idea persisted. Forests are assets, best managed through measurement, restriction, and classification. Development projects and the echo of empire. In the second half of the 20th century, as global development programs expanded, forestry became a key site of intervention. The World Bank, FAO, and other international agencies poured resources into afforestation and reforestation drives, plantation establishment for commercial logging, forest protection programs to combat erosion or climate risks. But often, these efforts relied on the same inherited tools: forest inventories, species yield projections, compartment mapping, community restrictions. In many cases, the community became a problem to be managed, not a partner. One 1982 World Bank-funded forestry project in India classified entire villages as encroachers because they lived near a teak reserve planted during British rule. The villagers had been there for generations. The documents referred to them as pressures on the landscape. The forestry remained colonial in form, if not in name. Paper success, ground failure. Even today, forest departments in many former colonies continue to file annual working plans, echoing their imperial predecessors. A 2018 working plan for a forest division in Madhya Pradesh, India includes a 10-year rotation cycle, precise annual allowable cut figures, maps marked with compartments A, F, soil profiles and fire risk calculations, provisions for bamboo, and tendu leaf extraction. The language is clinical, the system is exact. But on the ground, these forests face illegal mining, encroachment by industry, conflict with forest-dwelling communities over rights and access. The plan does not mention these. It does not ask whether the forest is thriving ecologically, only whether it is accounted for. As before, the report satisfies the institution, even if the forest is vanishing behind the paper. Forest rights movements, reclaiming trees from ledgers. In response to this legacy, movements have emerged to recenter people within forests. In India, the Forest Rights Act of 2006 marked a major shift. It sought to acknowledge indigenous and tribal communities, historic rights to forests, allow for community-managed forests outside the strict reserve structure, redress decades of displacement and criminalization. But implementation has been uneven. Forest departments, shaped by over a century of imperial control, have often resisted change. For many officers, the idea that communities can manage forests without permits, quotas, and inspection charts is still foreign. An activist in Odisha put it bluntly. They want us to measure trees. We want to know who planted them, who prayed there, and who fed their family under them. This is a battle of worldviews, one that sees trees as inventory, the other that sees them as ancestry. The plantation problem persists. Monoculture plantations, especially eucalyptus and acacia, remain dominant in forest policy across many former colonies. Why? They grow quickly. They yield predictable returns. They satisfy metrics for afforestation targets. Governments proudly report green cover increases, even if those increases are biodiverse deserts. Rows of eucalyptus are tall, uniform, and largely lifeless. These plantations often consume water excessively, suppress undergrowth, harming smaller flora, support few animals, displace local species and community uses. Still, the numbers look good in reports. The logic remains imperial, even if the pen has changed hands. Digital forestry, the empire enters the cloud. Now, even the paperwork has evolved. Forest surveys are done via satellite. Permits are issued online. Tree inventories are stored in cloud databases. GIS systems map every compartment in dazzling detail. But has the mindset changed? In many cases, digitization has simply made the same old system faster, not fairer. The questions of community rights, ecological diversity, and local memory are still rarely coded into the system. A forest official may now click on a satellite image and see a green patch classified as dense, but they cannot see whether it is a sacred grove, whether women collect herbs there, whether children learn their clan's history under that tree. The data is complete and utterly silent. Closing reflections: what was gained, what was felled. Colonial forestry left behind more than stumps. It left systems of thought. That forests are numbers. That nature is something to be tamed, regulated, and taxed. That success is what fits into a ledger. It also left behind people whose lives were redefined as trespass, whose knowledge was dismissed as myth, and whose relationships with the forest were declared illegal. Today, forest policy in many parts of the world still wrestles with this legacy. The forms have changed, but the questions remain. Can a forest be managed without reducing it to paper? Can the trees be known without being numbered? Can we write new systems, not just new maps? So we end with a forest, not on a ledger but in memory. A grove where no tree was marked, but every child knew its name. Where no report was filed, but every elder remembered the day it bloomed. Where nothing was recorded, yet nothing was lost. Story 6. Soap, Sweat, and Status: The Quiet Power of Bathing in Ancient Greece. When you think of ancient Greece, you might think of grand philosophical dialogues, epic battles, or marble temples shimmering in Mediterranean sunlight. But history is not always made in grand arenas. Sometimes, it is shaped in places far more ordinary in this case, the bathing spaces of the classical world. This is the story of how something as simple as washing, rinsing, rubbing, scraping, sweating became a ritual, a marker of class, and eventually a tool of soft power. In the quiet heat of the bath chamber away from the public square, the Greeks cultivated not just cleanliness, but order, identity, and even politics. They may not have invented bathing, but they gave it meaning far beyond hygiene. The Greek approach to dirt. To the modern mind, dirt and cleanliness are medical matters. We understand germs, contagion, sanitation. But the ancient Greek concept of clean was as much about cosmic balance as it was about soap. Greek thought divided the world between cosmos order, clean, balanced, rational; chaos, disorder, dirty, wild, uncontrolled. To cleanse the body was to reassert one's alignment with cosmos. A dirty man was not simply unwashed, he was undisciplined, perhaps even morally compromised. This was why athletes oiled and scraped their skin before and after contests. Priests and priestesses bathed before entering temples. Mourners and soldiers cleansed after funerals or battle. Washing was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply ritualistic. Soapless soap, the olive oil solution. Contrary to modern assumptions, the Greeks did not use soap in the modern sense. Instead, they bathed using olive oil applied to the skin to loosen dirt. Strigils, curved metal scrapers used to remove the oil, along with sweat and dust. Water, not necessarily hot, often cool or tepid, poured from jugs or splashed from basins. Sand or ash occasionally used as abrasives before oiling. A typical sequence for a bath. Enter gymnasium, exercise often naked. Oil up to protect skin and enhance appearance. Exercise intensely, wrestling, running, discus. Scrape down, use strigil to remove the oily, dusty grime. Cold rinse, sometimes in a shallow pool or with ladles of water. Re-oil lightly and dress. This process was not just functional, it was aesthetic. A smooth, well-oiled, evenly scraped body was a symbol of discipline and beauty. The gymnasium, temple of the naked body. The gymnasium was more than a workout space, it was the heart of Greek male social life, and its connection to bathing was direct and inseparable. In the gymnasium, men trained, studied, debated, and bathed. It was where young men were trained in paideia, the full development of body, mind, and ethics. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle walked and lectured. Artists observed the human form in motion. Bathing here was a shared act, but also a hierarchical one. Wealthier citizens brought their own oils and slaves to assist. The poor used communal supplies or went without. Older men commanded space and respect in the bathhouse. Younger men were often judged, even courted by appearance. Bathing was thus performance, a quiet show of status, masculinity, and polish. Women and water, a different ritual. Women in ancient Greece bathed too, but differently and separately. Domestic bathing. Most women bathed at home, using ceramic basins, lautrophoros, and jugs. Public fountains. Cities like Athens had public water sources where women washed and collected water. Sacred bathing. Ritual washing was required for marriage, childbirth, and temple service. One notable ritual, the prenuptial bath. Before marriage, a woman bathed in sacred water, often from a specific spring or river tied to local legend. This wasn't about beauty, it was about purity, transformation from one stage of life to another. In some temples, water was so central that entire sanctuaries were built around sacred pools, and only after ritual cleansing could one approach the deity. Baths and boundaries, who could bathe and when. As bathing moved beyond the home and gymnasium, early public bathhouses began to appear in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, often near agoras, markets, or religious precincts. These early facilities were small single-room structures, heated by primitive hypocaust systems or open fires, equipped with basins, not large pools, often attended by a Balanius bath attendant. Access varied. Citizens used baths as part of daily routine. Foreigners were allowed, but not always welcomed. Slaves might be allowed to clean themselves, but rarely with dignity or luxury. Philosophers debated whether frequent bathing was noble or indulgent. Some thinkers like Socrates took a skeptical view. Excessive grooming, they believed, distracted from virtue. Still, the culture of bathing persisted not as indulgence, but as civilized behavior. A note on smell, perfume, and deodorization. The ancient Greek world was not odorless. In fact, smell played a major role in perceptions of cleanliness. After bathing and oiling, many Greeks applied perfumed oils, particularly Kaiphai sweet complex scent, myrrh, rose, cinnamon or cardamom-infused oil. These weren't just about smelling nice, they were associated with mood, energy, and virtue. A well-scented man was seen as thoughtful and composed. An overpoweringly perfumed man might be mocked for effeminacy. Smell, like every other aspect of bathing, was part of a larger moral code. Closing this section, when washing was a statement. To bathe in ancient Greece was not to clean off the day, it was to enter society, to show oneself to the world as ordered, balanced, and prepared. Even in its simplicity, water, oil, scraper bathing was filled with meaning, and like many other acts in antiquity, it blurred the line between the physical and the philosophical. But as the centuries progressed and Greece came under Roman rule, these humble bathing spaces would evolve. Baths would become bigger, hotter, more elaborate, and more controversial. So we leave this section with a quiet question, echoing off the tiles of a simple stone basin. When did bathing stop being a ritual and start becoming a spectacle? By the 2nd century BCE, the influence of Greek culture on Rome was profound. Greek art, language, philosophy, and even ideas about bathing crossed the Ionian Sea and seeped into Roman daily life. But the Romans didn't just adopt Greek customs, they amplified them. Where the Greeks bathed with modest basins and olive oil, the Romans built cathedrals of cleansing, vast public bathhouses that were feats of engineering, symbols of empire, and instruments of social control. Bathing ceased to be just a personal ritual. It became public theater, urban infrastructure, and a subtle declaration of Roman superiority over the very people whose customs they borrowed. This section explores that transformation and how the quiet Greek oil-scraping ritual evolved into an imperial performance of soap, sweat, and spectacle. Greek roots, Roman infrastructure. Early Roman bathing habits were relatively humble, simple cold baths, often inside the domus, private home, or balneum, small bathhouse. But as Rome expanded, so too did its bath culture. Romans admired the Greek gymnasium but found it too limited, too academic, and a bit too Greek. Instead, they created something grander, the thermae. Thermae weren't just for cleaning, they were for socializing, exercising, business dealings, eating, reading, philosophizing. And yes, for bathing. Where a Greek bathhouse might hold a dozen men, Roman thermae could accommodate thousands. Famous examples include Thermae of Caracalla, completed till 216 CE, spanning over 30 acres with pools, libraries, and gardens. Baths of Diocletian, the largest of all with a capacity of 3,000 people. Baths of Agrippa, among the first large-scale public baths, built in 25 BCE. The Roman Empire turned personal hygiene into civic identity. The ritual expanded, room by room. A visit to a Roman therme followed a well-defined sequence, ritualistic, sensory, and deeply choreographed. A poditerium, changing room. Patrons undressed, leaving clothes with an attendant caution. Theft was common. Wealthier citizens might have slaves accompany them. Palestra, exercise yard. Physical exertion, wrestling, ball games, weight training, a sweaty prelude to the bath itself. Tepidarium, warm room. A gentle acclimation zone with warm air relaxation, conversation, and slow transition to heat. Caldarium, hot room. Heated by hypocaust systems, underfloor fire channels. This was the heart of the Roman bath. Steam, sweat, and oil scrubbing, often communal and boisterous. Frigidarium, cold room. A bracing cold plunge pool to close the pores and invigorate the senses. Optional extras. Laconicum, a dry heat room like a sauna. Libraries and gardens, for reading or rest. Snack stalls or bars, for refreshments. This sequence was part habit, part performance. Citizens lingered, chatted, negotiated deals, and paraded their bodies. Cleanliness was just the excuse. Soap at last, the Roman introduction of sapo. Unlike the Greeks, Romans did eventually use a form of soap, though not universally. Called sapo, it was a mixture of animal fat and ashes. Thought to be imported from Gaul, modern France, where soap was more common. Used mainly by the upper classes and in certain provinces. However, the traditional Greek method, oil and strigil, remained dominant, especially in the Eastern Empire. This created a cultural layering. Greek East, oil and scraping persisted. Roman West, soap gained gradual traction. Still, bathing was less about what you used and more about who saw you using it. The bath as equalizer, or illusion of one. Roman public baths were nominally open to all, rich and poor, slave and citizen, soldier and senator. Entry was often cheap or free, subsidized by emperors to gain favor with the populace. But beneath the steam, hierarchies remained. Elite bathers arrived with retinues, oils, and bath slaves. The poor arrived with only a towel. Women had separate hours or spaces, though some mixed bathing did occur, often scandalously. Freedmen and foreigners were often treated coldly, despite being allowed entry. In this sense, the bath was both utopian and performative, a place where status could be briefly masked, but never fully erased. A graffiti from Pompeii reads, "I saw Marcus, son of a senator, scraping next to a mule driver. Both sweated, but only one left with sandals. The heat made equals of all, the exit did not." Hygiene versus health. Did bathing actually help? Ancient Roman baths were celebrated for their cleanliness, but by modern standards, they were microbial wonderlands. Shared water, reused without filtration. Communal scraping tools. Floors slick with sweat and oil. Minimal knowledge of contagion or germ theory. Yet paradoxically, bathing may have reduced illness in some contexts. Regular washing removed visible dirt and pests. Exposure to varying temperatures boosted circulation. Steam rooms may have eased respiratory issues. Still, outbreaks of skin infections, lice, and even plague spread through crowded baths. Physicians like Galen recommended moderate bathing. Too much was believed to weaken the body. Once again, the line between virtue and vice was thin, and bathing stood at its slippery center. Decline of the therme, from civic pride to imperial decay. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Roman Empire faltered, so too did its baths. Several factors contributed. Economic collapse. Maintenance of massive thermae became untenable. Barbarian invasions. Aqueducts were cut, cities abandoned, fires went out. Christian influence. Public nudity and luxury were viewed as immoral. Shifting priorities. Military spending and crisis management replaced civic luxury. Some baths became marketplaces, others were looted for marble and plumbing. A Greek practice, made Roman grand, began to fade from public life, leaving behind only ruins and memory. Closing this section, beneath the marble the steam still whispers. Roman baths remain architectural marvels. Their mosaics and arches still survive in places like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Trier. But beyond the stones lies a more subtle legacy, the cultural politics of washing. From Greek oiling to Roman soap, bathing evolved into a performance of citizenship, a marker of class, a medium of empire. To be clean was to be civilized. To bathe was to belong. But what happens when bathing becomes forbidden or forgotten? As the empire fell and the West entered what some historians still call the Dark Ages, the bathhouse doors closed, and with them, centuries of washing, scraping, and stewing. So we end this section with a chilling image. A cold, quiet caldarium, the fire out, the water stagnant, the marble echoing with absence. When did the bath stop being a ritual of civilization and start being seen as a danger? In the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many of the great bathhouses of antiquity fell into disrepair. Aqueducts crumbled, hypocausts cooled, the steam faded, and silence settled over stone pools once filled with voices and laughter. But the story of bathing didn't end it transformed, quietly and profoundly. This final section follows the fading echoes of the Greek and Roman bathing traditions into the early Middle Ages. It explores how the meanings of cleanliness shifted from physical to moral, from public to private, and from healthful to dangerous. Because in the new world that emerged from Rome's ashes, being clean wasn't always considered virtuous. Bathing without an empire, what survived and what didn't. After Rome's fall in the 5th century CE, much of Western Europe entered a prolonged period of decentralization, conflict, and upheaval. Urban centers shrank or vanished. Infrastructure collapsed. Roads became paths. Aqueducts dried up. Bathing, once a civic ritual tied to empire, became fragmented. Small bathhouses survived in some cities, often attached to monasteries or private homes. In the Byzantine East, Roman-style baths continued in reduced form for centuries. In the Islamic world, the Roman bath evolved into the letter 1e25 a macron m, which flourished across North Africa, the Middle East, and Spain. But in Western Europe, especially in the Latin Christian world, bathing entered a period of suspicion. Not disappearance, but redefinition. Christianity and the body, purity reimagined. Early Christian doctrine did not inherently oppose bathing. Monasteries, especially in the 6th and 7th centuries, often had rules allowing for regular washing. However, over time, attitudes shifted. Cleanliness of the soul came to outweigh the body. Excessive concern with appearance was associated with pride or vanity. Public nudity, once normal in baths, was increasingly linked to immorality. Shared bathing between men and women, tolerated in some Roman and even early Christian contexts, became inappropriate, even sinful. By the 9th century, some clergy preached that bathing might open the door to temptation. A clean body, they feared, often carried with it an unclean mind. One 10th century Frankish bishop reportedly advised, "Wash your soul with prayer more often than your body with water." This wasn't universal, but the tone was shifting. The medical view, a dangerous opened body. While some historians overstate the notion that medieval people never bathed, it is true that bathing became more sporadic, and that part of this was medical. The dominant medical theories of the time were based on Galenic humors. In this framework, the body was a system of fluids in balance. Bathing, especially in hot water, was thought to open the pores, making the body vulnerable. Open pores allowed bad air, miasma, or illness to seep in. Doctors warned that hot baths might cause melancholy or weakness. Sudden cold plunges could shock the heart. Prolonged steam could disturb the vital spirits. Instead, physicians began recommending dry cleaning techniques, rubbing the body with linen cloths, using scented powders or herbal satchels, changing clothes more frequently rather than washing skin. Hygiene hadn't vanished, but the method had inverted. Monasteries and minimalism, the practical bath. Monastic life in early medieval Europe included forms of regular cleansing, though often minimal and controlled. Monks might bathe a few times a year, tied to holy days or penitential calendars. Bathing was usually private, functional, and cold. Emphasis was on discipline, not indulgence. The rule of St. Benedict, 6th century, allowed bathing when necessary and particularly for the sick or elderly. But the idea of a warm, relaxing bath, shared communally, that belonged to the past or to the East. Yet ironically, monasteries preserved Roman engineering knowledge. Some abbeys had working aqueducts and even primitive heating systems, but these were the exception. By and large, Europe had lost the cultural logic of the thermae, the Arab world, and the preservation of bathing culture. In contrast, the Islamic world, drawing from Roman, Greek, and Persian traditions, embraced bathing with enthusiasm and structure. The letter 1e25, a macron M, became a central feature of Muslim cities. Bathing was tied to ritual purification, wudu and ghusl, required before prayer. Architectural traditions evolved: domed roofs, steam regulation, water-saving techniques. In cities like Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo, bathhouses flourished. Travelers from Christian Europe visiting Muslim lands often remarked, with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, on the cleanliness of their hosts. By the 11th and 12th centuries, crusaders returning from the Levant brought back more than stories. They brought renewed contact with bath culture. Bathing returns, quietly, unevenly. By the High Middle Ages, 12th–13th centuries, public baths began reappearing in European cities. Paris, London, Regensburg, and Florence all had stewhouses or bathhouses. These were often privately operated but publicly accessible. Services included hot water, towels, sometimes even meals and entertainment. But danger remained. Bathhouses were associated with sex work and disease, sometimes viewed as sites of moral decay, vulnerable to accusations during outbreaks of plague or fire. During the Black Death, 1347–1351, many bathhouses were shuttered. The fear of contagion, the belief that bathing opened the body to disease, and the moral stigma combined into a cultural retreat. Still, private bathing persisted. Wealthy homes had copper tubs. Perfumes, scented oils, and linen rubbing cloths remained popular. A return to oils and cloths, echoes of the Greeks. Ironically, the medieval preference for dry washing mirrored earlier Greek practices. Olive oil replaced with rosewater or vinegar. Strigils replaced with cloths. Communal scraping replaced with private servants or self-cleaning. Greeks had bathed for order. Medieval nobles now washed for status, decorum, and spiritual clarity, if not too often. Closing reflections, a ritual remembered in fragments. By the end of the medieval period, bathing in Western Europe had become a patchwork, a tangle of religious caution, medical confusion, and fragmented memory. The Greco-Roman tradition had not vanished. It had fractured, survived in monasteries, hibernated in manuscripts, and persisted across cultural borders. Cleanliness had become internalized, moralized, and privatized. Washing the body was no longer a civic ritual, it was a personal choice, a religious act, or sometimes a risk. But even as the baths cooled, the idea of cleanliness as virtue remained. It would take new epidemics, new medical knowledge, and new empires to bring the bathhouse back, this time not as marble sanctum, but as ceramic-tiled necessity. So we leave this story with a quiet moment. A forgotten bathhouse in rural France, the roof long gone, a stone basin filled with leaves, a strigil rusting in the dirt. Once this was a site of civilization, now it's history's echo.